At 9:11 on the evening of July 4th, 1942, a signal went out from the Admiralty in London to the commanders of every warship escorting Convoy PQ17 through the Barents Sea. Most immediate, cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. 12 minutes later, at 9:23. Owing to threat of surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. 13 minutes after that, a third signal arrived with a small but significant change of wording. Convoy is to scatter. On the bridge of the destroyer Ledbury, Commander Roger Hill took in what he was being ordered to do. He was being told to abandon 34 merchant ships in the middle of the Arctic Ocean and sail away. He was being told that Tirpitz was out there somewhere and that protecting the convoy was impossible. He was being told that his job was to save his warship and leave the merchant ships to find their own way to Russia. He did it. The Navy followed its orders. And then Roger Hill watched his radio operators take down the messages that started coming in from the ships he had just left behind. "I'm being bombed by a large number of planes. On fire in the ice. Abandoning ship. 6 submarines approaching on the surface." He never got over it. He said so decades later in plain terms. He had a lot of company. The Arctic convoy route existed because of a promise Winston Churchill made to Joseph Stalin. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Within weeks, it was clear that the Red Army was losing on a scale that no one in London had predicted, and that if the Soviets collapsed, Germany would control the entire European continent, and could turn everything it had westward. Churchill's calculation was straightforward. Keeping Stalin in the war was Britain's most important strategic objective. If that meant sailing ships through the most dangerous waters on Earth, through the Arctic in winter and under 24-hour daylight in summer with German air bases less than 200 miles away, then that was what it meant. The convoys to Russia used 2 main ports, Murmansk, closer and more accessible, but subject to German land and air attack since it was just 30 miles from the Finnish border, and Arkhangelsk, farther east, farther from the Germans, but frozen from November to spring. The routing went up through the Norwegian Sea, north of Bear Island, between Spitsbergen and the Norwegian coast, then east through the Barents Sea. At the narrowest point, the convoy route passed within reach of every German airfield in Norway. The convoys ran through 1941 and into 1942, and they were dangerous from the start. German aircraft shadowed them. German submarines were repositioned to the Arctic when the convoys started. The weather could kill you regardless of what the Germans were doing. Arctic storms destroyed lifeboats and swept men off the decks of warships. Pack ice could trap a ship. The water temperature was near freezing, which meant that a man who ended up in it without rescue within minutes was not going to survive. The men who sailed these routes knew all of this. The merchant sailors who ran the cargoes and the naval crews who escorted them were not naive about the odds. The cargo was tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, raw materials. The Soviets needed it to fight. The ships went anyway. By the summer of 1942, the convoys were carrying American equipment under the Lend-Lease program, as well as British. This made Convoy PQ17 the first major joint Anglo-American naval operation under British command. On June 27th, 34 merchant ships, mostly American, departed Hvalfjord in Iceland for Arkhangelsk. Admiral Hamilton commanded the close covering cruiser squadron. Commodore John Dowding commanded the merchant convoy. Commander Jack Broom commanded the close escort. The cargo was extraordinary. More than 300 tanks, 210 aircraft, 3,350 vehicles, over 100,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, and food. Enough material to equip an army of 50,000 men. $1 billion in 1942 currency. The convoy had lost 3 ships to German attacks in the first days of the voyage. It had beaten off multiple air attacks. As it passed Bear Island on July 4th, the men aboard were cautiously optimistic. They had covered more than half the route. The worst of the German air bases were behind them. The Soviet air cover might even reach them at the far end. Then the signals came. The decision to scatter Convoy PQ17 was made by one man sitting in London, 3,000 miles from the ships he was abandoning. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound was the first Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy. He had served in 2 world wars. He had commanded a battleship at Jutland. He had risen to the top of his service through 4 decades of steady, thorough work. Churchill called him Churchill's anchor. The Royal Navy respected him. By July of 1942, Pound was also a sick man, though the full extent of his illness was not known. He suffered from hip degeneration that disrupted his sleep and caused him to doze off at meetings. His fleet medical officer had discovered a brain tumor, but had not reported it to the Admiralty. A paper later published in a medical journal described him as showing, at this period, severe symptoms of mental exhaustion and possibly also of brain destruction. Whether any of that had any bearing on the decision he made on the night of July 4th is a question historians have argued about since the war. What is documented is this. The intelligence Pound received suggested that the German surface force, including Tirpitz, had departed Altafjord and was heading toward the convoy. The intelligence was based on the absence of confirmation that they were still in port, not on positive sighting reports showing them at sea. His own staff recommended not giving the scatter order. The commanders at sea, Hamilton and Broome and Dowding, were not consulted. Pound made the decision alone, issued 3 signals in 25 minutes, and ordered the escort away and the convoy to scatter. Tirpitz was not within 300 or 400 miles of the convoy when the scatter order went out, per Roger Hill's post-war testimony. The German Naval Task Force had left Altafjord in the early hours of July 5th, briefly entered the Norwegian Sea, and then been ordered back. The German High Command was worried about British submarines and carrier aircraft. Vice Admiral Otto Schneewind, commanding from Tirpitz's bridge, was waiting for authorization from the Kriegsmarine command chain that passed through 3 levels of authority before it could reach Dönitz. By the time the authorization pathway was resolved, the convoy had already scattered and the attack was called off. German aircraft and submarines could finish the job without risking the Tirpitz. Pound defended his decision publicly. An inquiry in Parliament assigned no blame, on the grounds that the First Sea Lord had legitimate authority to issue the order. He continued in his role for 14 more months. In September 1943, he suffered a paralytic stroke at the Quebec Conference and resigned. He died on October 21st, 1943. It was Trafalgar Day. Churchill called the event one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. He did not say whose fault it was. When the 3 scatter signals arrived on July 4th, the merchant ships had 2 options, and no good ones. They could try to reach the Soviet ports independently, sailing alone across hundreds of miles of the Barents Sea without escort, in waters that German aircraft had been patrolling for 3 days, and that German submarines had been repositioning into. Or they could try to find somewhere to hide. Most of them tried for the ports. July 5th was the worst single day. 12 ships were sunk. The German Luftwaffe put every aircraft it could reach into the air over the now dispersed convoy. Junkers, Ju-88 bombers, and Heinkel. He-111 torpedo bombers filled the air. With the convoy scattered over hundreds of miles of open water, there were no escorts to put up anti-aircraft fire. No ships close enough to help when another ship was hit. No one to pick up survivors quickly before the cold water killed them. The Luftwaffe flew over 200 sorties against the scattered convoy and lost only 5 aircraft. The exchange rate was not a ratio. It was one-sided slaughter. The American freighter Fairfield City was hit on July 5th by German aircraft and sank before most of the crew could get off. The Daniel Morgan was also hit that day. The Carlton was torpedoed by a submarine, and a German U-boat came alongside the lifeboats to question the captain about the convoy, a practice that was still legal under international law and that gives a sense of how unthreatened the Germans felt at that point. On July 6th, the Pan-Atlantic was hit by 2 bombs dropped by a Junkers Ju-88 shortly after 6 in the evening. The ship sank in under 4 minutes. There was no time to send a distress signal. Seaman Second Class Donald Nagatz, a 20-year-old from North Dakota who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, had been assigned to the Naval Armed Guard on the Pan-Atlantic. He was manning a machine gun when the bombs hit and was thrown into the Arctic water. He survived. Others pulled him from the water. He spent the rest of his life with the knowledge of how close the margin had been. U-255 was one of the most active submarines in the area. It sank the John Witherspoon on July 6th and 2 more ships over the following 2 days, including the Olopana and the Alcoa Ranger. The U-boat crews were operating in the most favorable conditions they would see at any point in the war. No escorts, scattered targets, good weather. The water temperature that made survival in the Arctic so unforgiving was also the water temperature at which a submarine could run at depth with excellent acoustics. The last ships were lost on July 10th, the Hoosier and the El Capitan. By then, the rescue ships had been pulling survivors from the water for 5 days. Of the 34 ships that left Iceland, 23 sank in the Barents Sea. The 11th ship to reach port arrived at Arkhangelsk and completed a convoy that by the time it was over had ceased to resemble a convoy in any organized sense. There were 210 aircraft on those ships when they left. Most of them were on the bottom of the Barents Sea. The men who survived the sinkings and were picked up by the rescue ships and the trawlers were brought to the Soviet Union. Some were treated for injuries and hypothermia, and then assigned to whatever vessel needed crew for the return voyage. Some waited weeks before transport home could be arranged. They had left from Iceland in late June. They arrived back in Britain in September in some cases, 3 months after a voyage that was supposed to take 2 weeks. The merchant marine assigned casualty status to the men on the sunken ships, and families received telegrams. And the men who had made it through dealt with the experience in the ways available to them in 1942, which mostly meant going back to sea. The Arctic route was still open. The cargo still needed to move. They went. Not everyone obeyed the scatter order the way it was intended. Lieutenant Leo Gradwell was not a career naval officer. Before the war, he had been a barrister in Liverpool, practicing on the Northern Circuit. He spoke 6 languages. He had gone to Balliol College at Oxford and studied classics. He had a coastal navigation certificate from sailing in the Irish Sea in his spare time. When the war started, he joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and was given command of the Ayrshire, a 575-ton anti-submarine trawler crewed by volunteer fishermen. The Ayrshire was not a warship in any meaningful combat sense. She was a repurposed fishing boat with depth charge rails, a gun on the bow, and a crew who knew how to work in cold water. She had no charts for the Arctic waters north of the convoy route. When the scatter order came on July 4th, Gradwell looked at where he was and made a calculation. He was already heading north. The ice was not far. If he kept going in that direction, he might be able to bring some merchant ships with him into a place the Germans wouldn't look. He found the Troubadour first, a Panamanian registered ship carrying a remarkable cargo. In addition to her other freight, she had Sherman tanks on the deck and drums of white paint in the hold. Gradwell gathered the Troubadour, then the Ironclad, then the Silver Sword. With 4 ships and no charts and only a sextant and a copy of the Times World Geographic pocketbook, he navigated northward into the ice pack. When the ships became locked in the ice, he stopped their engines and banked their fires so they made no smoke. Then, he opened the Troubadour's paint drums. The crews painted every visible metal surface white. The hatch covers and surfaces that couldn't be painted were covered with white bed sheets and tablecloths. Gradwell opened the hatch covers on the tank cargo, and the Sherman tank's 37mm guns were manned and loaded, pointing skyward as makeshift anti-aircraft weapons. German reconnaissance aircraft, Blohm and Voss flying boats that the crews called flying clogs for their distinctive profiles, flew patrols along the edge of the ice pack. They were looking for ships hiding at the ice edge. They searched along the boundary between ice and open water. Gradwell had driven his ships 25 miles into the interior of the ice pack. The Germans flew overhead. They saw white ice for miles in every direction. They turned and flew back to their bases. The 4 ships stayed in the ice for 3 days. On July 7th, as the German search effort was winding down with most of its targets already sunk, Gradwell brought his little convoy out of the ice and navigated to the Matochkin Strait on the island of Novaya Zemlya. British corvettes found them there. They were escorted to Arkhangelsk and arrived on July the 25th. All 4 ships and their cargoes made it. The Sherman tanks that had served as anti-aircraft batteries were unloaded at the dock and went to the Soviet armored forces. Gradwell received the Distinguished Service Cross on September 15, 1942. The citation described his actions. It did not have to explain what the alternative had looked like. Everyone in the Navy already knew. A 1943 Hollywood film about merchant mariners in the Battle of the Atlantic, starring Humphrey Bogart, drew directly on the Gradwell story for part of its plot. Real history had provided something that didn't need embellishment: 23 ships on the bottom of the Barents Sea. Think about what that meant in terms of the men aboard them. The Merchant Marine on Convoy PQ17 carried American and British and Panamanian crew, plus the American Naval Armed Guard detachments that manned the defensive guns on the merchant ships. The official count of Allied seamen killed was 153. The actual number may have been higher, since some ships sank without survivors and without distress signals, and their final crew counts were reconstructed from departure manifests. 153 men who left Iceland on June 27th and never came back. They were not naval combatants in the traditional sense. They were merchant sailors who had signed on to carry cargo to an ally who needed it to fight a war. They were going to get paid for the voyage, and they knew the route was dangerous, and they went anyway. The merchant marine crews of 1942 didn't get to choose easy voyages. The cargo went where it was needed, and the men went with the cargo. Some of them had been making runs across the North Atlantic since 1939 and had survived 3 years of submarine warfare in the main convoy lanes before being assigned to Arctic service. Others were on their first voyage. The Naval Armed Guard personnel, like Donald Naggatz from North Dakota, were often young men who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and found themselves assigned to merchant ships because someone had to man the defensive guns. Naggatz had been in the Navy for 7 months when the Pan-Atlantic sailed from Iceland. He had enlisted in January 1942, the month after Pearl Harbor, at 20 years old. His training complete, he was assigned as an armed guard to protect a merchant ship on one of the most dangerous routes in the war. The Navy sent where the Navy sent you. He was on his gun when the Junkers Ju-88 came in. 2 bombs, 3 minutes, into the Arctic water. The men who didn't get off the ships in time didn't die of German weapons. They died of the water. 4 degrees Celsius means roughly 15 to 20 minutes before a person's hands stop functioning and they can no longer hold on to anything. It means 45 minutes to an hour before the core body temperature drops enough to cause unconsciousness. For the men in the water after the Pan-Atlantic sank in 3 minutes, with no distress signal sent and no convoy escort nearby to respond, the calculation was entirely whether someone happened to pass close enough and quickly enough. Naggatz was pulled out. He was brought to the Soviet Union and eventually repatriated to the United States. He kept a survivor release card documenting what had happened. A photograph from the period shows him standing with 2 other armed guard survivors from the Pan-Atlantic after their return, Moses Guthrie and Dale Gosnell. 3 young men from the middle of the American continent standing on a dock somewhere, alive because of timing and luck in the Arctic Ocean. Their cargoes are still there too. 23 ships on the seabed of the Barents Sea, 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, 3,350 vehicles, 109,000 tons of other cargo. The Soviet army was fighting in conditions of material shortage in the summer of 1942 that would have looked familiar to any analyst from the previous year, and those supplies might have made a difference to that situation in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate. Stalin's reaction to the news was to accuse the Western Allies of lying. He said he found it impossible to understand how so many ships could have been lost. He said, in writing to Churchill, that the decision to order unescorted cargo ships to reach Soviet ports one by one was beyond his comprehension. He was scathing, and his scathing was diplomatically damaging at precisely the moment when the Allied coalition needed to be strongest. Churchill tried to explain. The explanation, which boiled down to the First Sea Lord believed Tirpitz might attack, did not land well in Moscow. Tirpitz had been sitting in Altafjord the whole time. She had briefly sortied and turned back before getting anywhere near the convoy. Stalin's anger, while not fully informed by the intelligence picture, was responding to a real thing. The ships had been abandoned, and the ships had died. Arctic convoys were suspended for 3 months after PQ17. The disaster was simply too recent and too complete for another large convoy to be organized and protected without a fundamental rethink of how the escort force was structured. The next convoy, PQ18, sailed in September 1942 with a substantially different protection arrangement. This time, the escort included the escort carrier Avenger with her own aircraft. 53 warships in total, compared to 20 for PQ17. The Germans still managed to sink 13 ships from PQ18, but the escort force accounted for 44 German aircraft in return. The mathematics had changed in at least one direction. The convoys to Russia continued through 1942, 1943, and 1944. They were never easy. The Arctic route remained one of the most dangerous sea passages in the war, combining enemy action with conditions that could kill you without any enemy involvement at all. But the convoys continued, and the escort forces improved, and the loss rates that had made PQ17 look impossible to repeat were not, in fact, repeated at that scale. The Arctic convoys delivered, in total, over 4 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union. Tanks, aircraft, food, raw materials, vehicles, ammunition. The contribution to the Soviet war effort is genuinely debated by historians. Some Soviet accounts minimized it, though individual Soviet commanders frequently praised specific shipments as decisive to their operations at particular moments. The men who sailed the Arctic route didn't need historians to tell them whether it had mattered. They had done it, and they had watched some of them die doing it, and they knew the cargo had arrived. The U-boats that operated in Arctic waters from 1942 onward found conditions that were different from the Atlantic in important ways. The Arctic required that submarines handle extreme cold that affected mechanical systems. Diesel engines ran differently at those temperatures. Batteries degraded faster, and periscopes frosted. The crews wore more clothing and still froze. The water that came aboard during dives was cold enough to cause real hypothermia risk if it reached the crew spaces. But the hunting was extraordinarily good when a convoy was scattered. The U-boat commanders who worked the Arctic theater during the PQ17 weeks were operating in the best conditions they had seen or would see. Isolated merchant ships, no escort response, good weather and visibility for once. They sank ships until there were no more isolated ships to find. Donitz had argued before the war that submarines needed concentrated targets to be most effective. The scatter order that Pound gave had created something even better than a concentrated target. it had created 31 isolated ones. The House of Commons inquiry into the PQ-17 disaster concluded without assigning blame to anyone. The First Sea Lord had the authority to issue the order. The order had been issued. The question of whether it had been the right order was, the inquiry suggested, not one that a parliamentary body was qualified to resolve. The commanders at sea had a different view. Admiral Hamilton, who commanded the covering cruiser force and had led those cruisers away from the convoy on Pound's orders, wrote to Admiral Tovey afterward. He wrote that it would have been a great assistance to him had he known that the Admiralty had no better intelligence than he had already received. He added, paraphrasing the kind of thing that Nelson might have done, that perhaps he should have disregarded the signals. He had followed orders. He spent years not entirely sure he had made the right call. Commander Broome, who commanded the close destroyer escort, went further. He believed until the end of his life that the scatter order had been the single greatest mistake made by any Royal Navy commander during the war. He said so repeatedly. He wrote about it. The recrimination, as Roger Hill said, went on for years. Roger Hill himself was the one who put it most directly. In a recorded interview in 1996, he said, "There were 23 ships sunk in that PQ-17. 190 seamen killed, 400 to 5. 100 aircraft were lost, about 300 tanks and 100,000 tons of war material. That's what resulted from that Admiralty signal. It was really terrible. Even now, I have never got over it, because for the Navy to leave the Merchant Navy like that was simply terrible." He had said it 50 years after the event, and it still sounded like a man who had been trying to put it behind him and hadn't managed it. The German operation that Pound feared was real, in the sense that it had been planned and the ships had moved. Operation Rosselsprung, which translates as Knight's Move, was the plan for the German surface fleet to sortie from Norwegian fjords and destroy Convoy PQ-17 in a single surface engagement. The force assembled was formidable. Tirpitz, the largest warship Germany had built, along with the heavy cruisers Hipper and Scheer, the pocket battleship Lutzow, and 12 destroyers. Vice Admiral Otto Schneeven commanded the force from Tirpitz's bridge. They left Altafjord on the morning of July 5th, the day after the convoy scattered. This is worth noting. They left after the scatter order. Whatever intelligence Pound had received about their movements on July 4th, the German force had not yet sailed when he gave the order. The German departure from Altafjord was detected almost immediately by British submarine P-614 on patrol in the area. The information was relayed to the Admiralty. By the time it arrived, the scatter order had already been transmitted, and the convoy was already breaking up. Schneeven's task force moved north and west into the Norwegian Sea. Then, almost immediately, it stopped. The command chain for Rosselsprung required multiple levels of authorization to proceed. Schneeven needed permission from Admiral Karls at Naval Group North in Kiel, who needed permission from Grand Admiral Raeder in Berlin, who was waiting to see what Hitler would authorize. Hitler was worried about the British Home Fleet and its carrier aircraft. He had watched the Bismarck hunt in May of 1941 and had absorbed from it a conviction that the German surface fleet was too precious to risk against a competent opponent. He did not want to lose Tirpitz. The authorization chain never fully resolved. While the Germans were working through their command structure, a reconnaissance aircraft reported the British Home Fleet's position. The carrier aircraft were a real threat. Raeder, without direct confirmation that the convoy was defenseless, would not order Schneeven forward. By the afternoon of July 5th, Tirpitz and her task force turned around and returned to Altafjord. Dönitz was furious by the accounts available. The U-boats had been positioned specifically to cooperate with the surface force, and now the surface force had withdrawn and left them to handle the convoy alone. But the convoy had already scattered, and the U-boats and the Luftwaffe were already finishing the job. The surface fleet was no longer necessary. Tirpitz had never fired a gun in anger at Convoy PQ17. She had not been within 300 miles of it when the scatter order went out. She had briefly sortied after it was already too late for her to matter, been scared back by the threat of carrier aircraft, and returned to her fjord. And she had still destroyed the convoy. That is what it meant to have a fleet in being. The ship didn't need to fire. Its existence changed the decisions of the men defending against it, and those changed decisions did the killing. Not every merchant sailor who went into the water on July 5th and 6th and 7th was killed by the cold. Some were picked up. Some reached life rafts. Some spent days in the Arctic Ocean waiting for rescue. The armed trawlers that had been the close escort of PQ17, the small converted fishing boats like the Northern Gem and the Lord Austin and the Lord Middleton, were too small and too short-ranged to be part of the main escort withdrawal. They stayed in the area. They were the ships that came alongside the rafts and the lifeboats and pulled survivors out. The Northern Gem picked up men from multiple ships. Her crew worked in conditions that made the rescue as dangerous as the sinking. Ice coated the decks and froze the lines. Men who had been in the water long enough to be barely functional, needing to be physically lifted over the railing because they could no longer climb. The Gem's crew gave them their own clothing and their own blankets, and crowded the little ship with more people than she was built to carry. The rescue ships, 3 vessels specifically tasked with survivor recovery and equipped with medical facilities, operated throughout the disaster. They found men on rafts who had been adrift for days. Some of the men they found were coherent and mobile, others were not. The Arctic Ocean temperature at that time of year was roughly 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. A man without immersion gear in that water had perhaps 20 minutes of useful function before his hands stopped working, and perhaps 45 minutes before he lost consciousness. The difference between being rescued and not being rescued often came down to whether a ship passed close enough within that window. Some ships sank with no time for the crew to get off. The Pan-Atlantic, as described, went down in 3 minutes. Other ships were abandoned more slowly, and the crews had time to get into lifeboats before the hull went under. The experience of being in an open lifeboat in the Arctic in July was survivable, if cold, as long as rescue came within a reasonable time. The problem was that with the escort ships withdrawn, rescue within a reasonable time was not guaranteed. The Fairfield City survivors drifted in their lifeboats for hours before being found. The Bolton Castle, sunk on July 5th, had men on rafts for 2 days before they reached the Novaya Zemlya coast and found shelter in an abandoned hut. They survived on tinned food, salvaged from the wreck, and waited for rescue, which eventually came. Some survivors reached the coast of Novaya Zemlya independently, their ships damaged but still floating, limping eastward alone. The Azerbaijan, a Soviet tanker that had been part of the convoy, took a torpedo hit but didn't sink, and continued to Arkhangelsk under her own power while still on fire. The women in her crew, several of them, worked to control the damage and kept the ship moving. She arrived at Arkhangelsk with her cargo intact, still burning in the stern section, and docked next to the other survivors. The accounts of the days after the scatter differ in detail, but agree on one essential fact. The men who survived did so because of individual decisions and individual luck in a situation that their own navy had abandoned them to. Some of them felt that keenly. Some of them never stopped feeling it. The 23 ships are still there. The Barents Sea is deep in most places, and cold enough that the wrecks are well preserved by the same temperatures that made the route so deadly. The cargo on some of them has been identified through archival records: tanks, vehicles, aircraft in crates, objects that were supposed to arrive at a Soviet port in the summer of 1942. They have been at the bottom of the Barents Sea ever since. The significance of PQ17 extended beyond the material losses, as large as those were. It demonstrated, in a way that could not be undemonstrated, what happened when a convoy's escort was withdrawn. The entire theory of the convoy system was that there was safety in numbers, and that a concentrated escort could defend a concentrated convoy. The scatter order had tested the opposite theory, that dispersed ships were harder to find. The theory had failed completely. The evidence was on the seabed. The post-PQ17 response by Allied convoy planners was to insist on better escort ratios, better anti-aircraft, coverage from escort carriers, and better coordination between naval and air assets. The lesson was applied to Atlantic convoys as well as Arctic ones. The techniques that eventually defeated the U-boat campaign in 1943 were developed in the context of a system that had been reformed, partly in response to what PQ17 had revealed. The Admiralty also drew a quieter lesson. The procedures around issuing scatter orders were revised without fanfare. The circumstances under which a First Sea Lord could overrule the commanders at sea and order a withdrawal became substantially more constrained. The specific type of decision that Pound made on July 4th, acting on the absence of confirming intelligence rather than on positive evidence, was not made again in the same way. Germany suspended further offensive surface operations against Arctic convoys. Hitler's reluctance to risk Tirpitz had been confirmed rather than overcome by the brief sortie and return. She went back to Kafjord and continued to exist as a strategic threat, tying down the British Home Fleet for 2 more years until the Lancaster bombers finished her at Tromsø in November 1944. She never fired a shot in anger at a convoy. Her ghost had been more lethal than she ever was in person. The convoys to Russia continued after the 3-month suspension. Convoy PQ17 sailed in September 1942 with 53 warships and an escort carrier. 13 ships were sunk, but the Luftwaffe lost 44 aircraft in return. The mathematics had changed. The months of revised doctrine and strengthened escort had produced a convoy that could defend itself, at a cost, in conditions where PQ17 had been defenseless. The Arctic convoys delivered 4 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union by war's end. The men who sailed them did not stop after July 1942 had shown them what could happen. They adjusted, and they went back, and they kept going. Roger Hill commanded destroyers for the rest of the war. He served in the Mediterranean and the English Channel. He received the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Service Cross. He was good at his job, and he survived it. After the war, he wrote a book called Destroyer Captain and recorded interviews for historians. He talked about his career in full, and when he got to PQ17, he always said the same thing. He had never got over it. Half a century later, the same anger and the same grief were still there in his voice when he described following those signals away from those ships. He was not wrong to follow the order. The signals were clear and came from the highest authority in the Royal Navy. Every professional instinct would have been to comply. He complied. He was also not wrong about what it cost. The 23 ships and the 153 men. The tanks and aircraft on the bottom of the sea that never reached an army that needed them. The Admiralty conducted its inquiry. The inquiry found no one at fault. The First Sea Lord who issued the order died 14 months later of a brain tumor he had been carrying since before the war. He never answered publicly for what he had ordered. Leo Gradwell went back to practicing law after the war. The barrister who had taken his trawler into the Arctic ice pack and painted 3 merchant ships white came home to Liverpool and resumed his career. He didn't talk about the Arctic much, by the accounts available. He had done what seemed right in the circumstances, and it had worked, and then he had put it behind him the way professionals do. Roger Hill did not put it behind him. He wrote about it, and spoke about it, and gave interviews to oral history archives and said the same thing every time. He lived until 2007. He was 94 years old when he died, having outlasted almost everyone connected with PQ17 on either side of the war. He had 65 years to think about what he had heard on his radio that July night. He said it was always the last thing he thought about before he fell asleep.